fact they've done what they've done indicates they don't have the kind of discrete intelligence they had earlier on. So the height of the fighting in the campaign, admittedly under significant pressure, the Israelis spent a lot more trying to make sure that the targets they were engaging were legitimate targets, and they tried to minimize collateral damage. I fear that that's not what happened last night. I think they had some information, and they reacted to that information, and we ended up with these significant civilian casualties. So we can obviously discuss how many there really were or whatever, but there's a significant civilian casualty from there. I think it's very serious. I mean, I think the ceasefire was always fragile. There was always a potential from both sides to break it for different reasons, and both required both sides to show quite a lot of restraint in terms of what they did, and neither side have kept completely to that. But last night's attack was extremely serious. There's always an argument about how many people were killed or not killed, but it does look like a substantial number of civilians were killed in the attack, and that's going to make it very difficult for either side then to come together and to talk. It is interesting that this conversation about whether the ceasefire agreements have been broken or not has been playing out for a number of days now. The argument from others' perspective is that Israel has also failed to maintain its ceasefire agreements, particularly the withdrawal of some of its troops from the so-called Philadelphia corridor out with the main area of Gaza as well. I cannot imagine the sheer horror of the hostage and the hostage family. I mean, taking hostages is a really wicked thing to do. So I'm no qualms in being very robust about that. But there was a hope and expectation that the hostages would be released on a process which has been ongoing, and it's not been without its problems. This is not going to make it easier for either Hamas or those who have been acting as their interlocutors, the Egyptians and the Qataris, to persuade Hamas to go forward and allow the hostages to come out. But the truth of the matter is that of the two aims that Netanyahu had, he had two aims when he did it. The first was to recover the hostages, which had kind of universal support within Israel. I hope all decent people had the same view. But his second war aim was always about the elimination of Hamas, and there was a conversation about whether it was elimination as a military force or as political force. He seems to have settled on military and political force, but that means that it's very, who do you then talk to? Because effectively, the only thing that Hamas could then do is effectively unconditionally surrender, and I don't think they were going to do that. So he's effectively abandoning, or potentially abandoning, the hostages with their lives in order to achieve what he sees as his wider political and military aim, and that's a very hard thing for a lot of people to stomach. What they're doing is they're picking up the mood music from Washington, and the mood music from Washington is always been slightly divided, and even under President Biden's time, there was always this ambivalence about what they were trying to achieve. Were they trying to resolve the immediate issue around Gaza or Lebanon and Hezbollah in Lebanon, or they're looking for a kind of wider settlement? But there was at least a kind of it's like a dual process that was in play. I think with Washington now under President Trump, there's only one rule in play, which essentially is support Israel. And some people will welcome that. They'll say there's an absolute clarity about what they're doing, but that comes at a price, which essentially is the price of instability across the entire region. I don't think actually it's in the West's interest. I really don't think it's actually in America's interest to do that. The greater interest is in trying to find a way to help these groups of countries who have had fought many times to try and work and be together, however complicated and difficult that is. But by taking a very kind of single but robust line down, saying we'll support Israel, effectively come hell or high water, you end up with what we've got. So a series of attacks across the region. In terms of a kind of reinvasion, the head of the Israeli armed forces has said the only way they could do that would be by a kind of mass mobilization again. Now, one of the things they've tried not to do is have all of their reserves, and they are very much a small regular cadre armed force with a significant reserve component. What they've been trying to do now is to they'd have to call up a lot of those reserves again in order to conduct a sort of second major invasion of Gaza, and that comes at a huge economic and social cost. And so whether the kind of will and resources available to do that is questionable. The peace settlement, there's a phase 2 and beyond, which was part of the original ceasefire agreement, really was looking at the very complex issue about what is going to be the future of Gaza and indeed the Palestinian state. And that's always going to be problematic to frame, particularly for Netanyahu, who's really dedicated his life and his political career to ensuring that there cannot be a sort of independent, sovereign Palestinian state. I mean, that's really how he's operated. He called it the concept. Essentially, keep the two elements divided. He actually allowed Hamas to take over control in the Gaza Strip in 2007, precisely because it would split the Palestinians and therefore make sure that there'd be no viable state. And that's his difficulty, because for him to move to a peace settlement, that removes the kind of the plank upon which he's built his political career. And the other thing that's going on, and you will have seen it in the news as well, is that the internal politics of Israel has now turned very difficult for him. He's just removed the head of the Shin Bet, one of Israel's main intelligence services. This is causing an element of constitutional crisis, and he, of course, is back in court on corruption and other charges, all of which were to some extent put to one side while the fighting was going on, and very kind of robust, but quite maybe even slightly cynical Israeli commentators. And I recommend have a look at Haaretz, who've got a good commentary on this, saying essentially is that for him, resuming war means that he is not brought to face with the consequences of what he's doing. That's always been his policy, and that's what he's continued. Now, that might be a bit cynical, but there is certainly an element where the internal politics of Israel and the coalition and Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition is tied up with the wider peace settlement in the region. There was a hope that prior to the October the 7th attacks, prior to it, there was a positive movement developing with the so-called Abraham Accords, which is where by showing the common ancestry and common cultural fantasy of the alliance of the Israelis and the Arab peoples, through Abraham, that people were talking to each other. So you had Israel's reaching out to the Gulf states, reaching out to other areas, and with the great prize of Saudi recognition of Israel, and that was to sort of kind of reframe the Middle East, in which then some kind of arrangement, whether it be a two-state solution or a different solution, but some other kind of arrangement with the Palestinians could then take place. All that's been kind of blown out the window, and it'll be a hard ask now for asking those countries to keep moving forwards with the Abraham Accords and then work through. So, how far is a two-state solution away? I fear it's a long way away at the moment. And it'll be very hard, I think, to persuade Washington under President Trump that its long-term interest is still in finding some kind of peaceful and just solution for the Palestinian people. But I personally believe that's the only way it's going to work in the end, unless you follow the Trump line, which is throw everybody out of Gaza and then turn it into kind of Mar-a-Lago Mediterranean, which is just an awful prospect. There's no question about it. The one thing the Israelis are all united on, and is that the hostages must be returned. I think we shouldn't underestimate that. But the kind of policy of prioritizing whatever sort of end state strategy is, which is the total destruction of Hamas in all its forms, political and military, over the hostages, is not popular, and only a few elements of his coalition would support that. But they are the same people who would happily contemplate the total expulsion of the Palestinians, not just from Gaza, but also from the West Bank. And those are the people who Netanyahu are being kept in power by. That's who he's sold his soul to, and that's not representative of the whole of Israel.